Imagine a world teetering on a knife's edge. This was Europe in the early 1900s. A continent of powerful empires, each one hungry for more land, more wealth, and more control. Military parades filled city streets, national pride swelled, and secret promises were made in shadowy battles. Old grudges simmered just below the surface, waiting for a single spark to set the world ablaze. That spark came on a summer day, June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. A young Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. What should have been a regional tragedy spiraled into a global catastrophe with horrifying speed. Austria-Hungary, furious, pointed the finger at Serbia. Russia, seeing itself as Serbia's protector, mobilized its massive army. Germany, bound by a treaty to Austria-Hungary, declared its support. In response, France and Britain, allied with Russia, prepared for the inevitable. The complex web of alliances, designed to keep the peace, instead acted as a tripwire for war. Within weeks, the great powers of Europe were locked in a death grip. The lamps were going out all over Europe, and no one knew when they would be lit again. The Great War had begun. This wasn't a war of swift cavalry charges and heroic duels like the ones before. This was a new, industrial kind of slaughter. On the Western Front, which stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, soldiers dug in. They carved immense, complex networks of trenches into the earth's muddy ditches that would become their homes, their battlegrounds, and for millions, their graves. Life in the trenches was a living nightmare. Soldiers endured constant shelling, the stench of decay, swarms of rats, and rampant disease. The space between the opposing trenches, known as no man's land, was a terrifying moonscape of barbed wire, shell craters, and the unburied dead. To be ordered over the top meant climbing out of the relative safety of the trench and charging headlong into a hail of machine gun fire. The weapons themselves were more terrifying than anything seen before. The machine gun, once a clumsy novelty, could now mow down hundreds of men in minutes, turning frontal assaults into suicide missions. Artillery cannons grew larger and more powerful, capable of leveling entire towns and churning the battlefield into a sea of mud and blood. Then came the insidious horror of poison gas, drifting silently across no man's land to burn lungs and blind its victims. Armored vehicles, the first tanks, rumbled across the cratered fields, designed to break the stalemate of trench warfare. Beneath the waves, German U-boats or submarines prowled the shipping lanes, sinking vessels without warning and changing naval combat forever. Battles became months-long struggles of attrition. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the very first day. At Verdun, French and German forces bled each other white for 10 months, fighting over a few miles of devastated forest. The human cost was staggering. A generation of young men sacrificed 4 inches of ground. What began as a European conflict soon consumed the globe. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, joined the Central Powers Germany and Austria-Hungary up new fronts in the Middle East. Fierce fighting erupted in the deserts of Arabia and the mountains of the Caucasus. Colonial territories were also drawn into the fray, with battles taking place across Africa and Asia as Allied powers seized German colonies. Soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and across the British and French empires were sent to fight and die on European soil. The war was no longer just a European affair. It was a world war. The oceans became a critical battlefield. Britain's powerful navy blockaded Germany, attempting to starve it into submission. In response, Germany unleashed its U-boats in a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking not just military ships, but also merchant and passenger vessels. This strategy would ultimately prove to be a fatal miscalculation. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the British ocean liner Lusitania, killing over 1,000 people, including more than 100 Americans. This act outraged the United States, which had remained officially neutral. The final straws came in 1917. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, a direct challenge to American shipping. Then, British intelligence intercepted a secret message from Germany to Mexico, the infamous Zimmermann telegram. It proposed a military alliance against the United States, promising Mexico the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if they attacked their northern neighbor. Public opinion in America turned decisively. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The arrival of fresh American troops and vast industrial resources tipped the scales decisively in favor of the Allies. The Doughboys, as they were called, brought new energy to the exhausted Allied armies and signaled the beginning of the end for the Central Powers. By the autumn of 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing. 4 years of brutal warfare and the crushing Allied blockade had exhausted Germany's resources and shattered its morale. A final, desperate German offensive on the Western Front had failed. With the full might of the American army now in the fight, the Allies launched a counterattack that pushed the German lines back relentlessly. At home, the German people were starving, and revolution was in the air. The Kaiser's other allies began to surrender one by one. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were breaking apart from within. Finally, with his military defeated and his country in turmoil, the German Kaiser abdicated and fled. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, November 11th, all along the Western Front, the guns, for the first time in 4 long years, fell silent. World War I was over. The aftermath was a world utterly transformed, scarred beyond recognition. Over 16 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, were dead. Another 20 million were wounded, many maimed for life. Entire landscapes were poisoned and destroyed. The political map of Europe was redrawn. 4 great empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian, lain in ruins, their royal families deposed. From their ashes, new countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were born. But the peace that followed was deeply flawed. In 1919, the victorious Allied leaders met at the Palace of Versailles in France to hammer out a treaty instead of fostering reconciliation. The Treaty of Versailles placed the full blame for the war on Germany and imposed crippling reparations, territorial losses, and military restrictions. This peace created a deep sense of humiliation and resentment in Germany, planting the toxic seeds that would grow into an even more destructive conflict just 2 decades later. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was a tragic, brutal lesson in the dangers of unchecked nationalism, secret alliances, and industrialized warfare. It reshaped societies, toppled empires, and set the stage for the 20th century's greatest conflicts. Though the last veterans of the Great War are gone, its legacy endures in the borders on our maps, the international institutions we rely on, and the collective memory of a generation lost in the mud and fire of the trenches. It serves as a permanent, solemn reminder of the true cost of war and why we must always strive for peace. Thank you for watching. If you found this history meaningful, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world.